appears that corporate media is pushing a new war over Ukraine. So now there's an analysis of media headlines from some of the three of the biggest newspapers, news media organizations in the country. And that analysis found that they, of course, are pushing for conflict. A lot of pro-war, very hawkish opinions in the news. Now, that, of course, goes alongside with U.S. officials that are also adding fuel to the fire and saying that Ukraine is under imminent invasion from Russia. Russia's coming. They're going to come over the border. They're going to invade Ukraine, and they're going to seize and annex it just like they did Crimea. So now, look, before I get into the details of this story, I just want to remind you, because I'm sure you still already know by now, if you've been watching me for some time, that I'm not a fan of Russia. I've been very critical of Vladimir Putin. Russia, again, grabbed Crimea, it annexed it. I thought that that was wrong. I do not defend them on that issue. But that said, I'm also against war. And so what I'm seeing in the mainstream press right now is very, very concerning, and what looks like to be a manufacturing of consent for a hot war in Ukraine, which again would be disastrous for the United States, for Russia, and most importantly for the Ukrainian people. And so I'm not at all interested in that. So let's dive in to the details here. So as I said before, corporate media is sounding the alarm over a buildup of Russian troops close to the 1,200-mile border with Ukraine. In fact, according to reports, there's been almost 100,000 troops in that vicinity. But remember, they're inside their own border. They're in their own country. And so, yes, sure, whenever you hear reports of troop buildups near, other countries, like, oh no, right? Everybody gets a little bit spooked. I can understand that. It makes you think that something bad is going to happen. But I just want to urge everybody to look at the other side of the equation here. So I'm specifically referring to what helped escalate the situation to get here in the first place. And that would be the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe. So now, if you don't know, NATO is a military alliance that was made to counter the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but NATO does. And so NATO, even though the Soviet Union doesn't exist, has been adding member states to their military alliance, and they are hostile to Russia. So now, from their side, from the Russian side, I mean, if you're in Russia and you're seeing all these NATO states that were never friendly to you, that were always hostile to you, build up around your country, you're going to think, oh, well, that's kind of scary. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. And so you can kind of understand when you look at it from the other side, right? And so now, that said, Putin's an autocrat. Yes, he's the government of Russia is corrupt. It's run by oligarchs, oil barons, things like that. And so now Putin is a great example of an autocrat. Putin is using this situation to say, oh, look, hey, we're really being oppressed over here, right? And so you're provoking us. And by the way, he's kind of right about that. We have been provoking them because remember, NATO, especially since it's a hostile alliance to the Russians anyway, we also promised them, in a way, not to expand. And so think about it this way, right? If Russia had an alliance with Mexico, or any other country, by the way, and they were, not necessarily hostile, but a hostile power had an alliance with Mexico, or Mexico was considering joining a hostile alliance. And so Russia started shipping weapons, or they were expanding in South America. Well, then the United States would be very nervous, wouldn't we? Actually, there's a real world example of that already happening, and that was Cuba in the 1960s. That almost came to nuclear war. And so that's the danger here. So now there seems to be a debate going on about what promises were made to Russian leaders. about that future NATO expansion. Now, one side argues, well, we never really made an agreement. I mean, we never made a promise. Putin's just, he's just making things up so that he can justify invading Ukraine. Well, now, again, I'm going to tell you that nothing justifies an invasion. But on the other side, you have people saying, oh, actually, no, there was an agreement, not with Putin, but with the Soviet Union, with the Russians. And we get that from documentation that was declassified from the National Security Archive at George Washington University. Now, they released a large number of formerly classified documents that suggest it was an agreement not to expand NATO eastward as long as the Russians left East Germany alone. So now that was, again, near the breakup of the Soviet Union, right? And so now the Russians did not go into East Germany. Therefore, they kept their side of the bargain. However, NATO did not. Now, the document showed that multiple national leaders had been considering rejecting Central and Eastern European membership in NATO as of early 1990 and through 1991. Discussions in NATO in the context of German unification negotiations in 1990 were not at all narrowly limited to the status of East German territory, and that subsequent Soviet and Russian complaints about being misled about NATO expansion were founded in written contemporaneous memcons and telcons at the highest levels. It is a matter of record that in 1990, the U.S. Secretary of State James Baker had promised Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that it would not expand NATO into the formerly communist states of Eastern Europe. However, what happened? NATO expanded into the former communist states of Eastern Europe. By 1999, NATO had expanded to include Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, Latvia, Lithuania, and then Estonia. And so, yes, there has been NATO expansion. Now, to be fair, these countries, yes, they were brought into NATO. Now, that made the Russians understandably nervous. However, at that time, they were not being armed. So there weren't actually weapons and troops being shipped to those countries. However, that was, and by the way, let me give you more information here, more context. Several years after German reunification in 1997, NATO also said that in current and foreseeable security environment, there would be no permanent stationing of substantial combat forces on the territory of new NATO members. So again, those aforementioned NATO states or NATO members that were added post-Soviet Union through 1990 to 1999, yes, they were members of NATO, they were close to Russia, but they were not being given arms. Okay? And so now that's an important point. Okay? So, and it really kind of shows you how nuanced this conversation is. Okay? And so now, that said, that changed in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. So now that was a provocation from the Russians. That was an escalation. And so, as a result, you had NATO now arming and sending weapons and troops to these countries, which then, again, further escalates the situation after the first escalation, or I should say the second escalation, which is Putin annexing Crimea. And so understand that this is nuanced. You don't have any good guys here. Nobody's nobody's a saint, and nobody's just purely the victim, okay? And so this is international diplomacy, this is international politics, and it gets very complicated. And so, look, that's why there's so much tension these days. And that's why we still need to diffuse that tension. So now, I agree that Russia should not have annexed Crimea. Now, let me go into the media angle of this, which I think it's really, really important. That's after the history. So now, you look at mainstream corporate media, and what they're doing now is that they're trying to further inflame tensions at a time when right now we should be focusing on diplomatic solutions. 90% of recent opinion articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal have taken a very hawkish view on the conflict. So now, only taking into account NATO and the United States' point of view and painting Russia as the sole aggressor in everything, which I've just explained the history, why they are not the sole aggressor. Now, opinion columns have also expressed support for sending U.S. weapons and troops to the region. Now, as I've mentioned before, the number of troops on the border of Ukraine, you have a buildup. And that's no denying that. However, we've also seen similar buildups throughout the years with nothing happening. In fact, in 2015, Reuters and the New York Times claimed that Russia was massing troops and heavy firepower, including tanks, artillery, and rocket launchers, on the border, and again called for war. A year later, The Guardian reported that Russia would soon have 333,000 soldiers on the border. In 2017, the Wall Street Journal claimed that tens of thousands of soldiers were being deployed to the border. The New York Times upped that figure to as many as 100,000. A few months later, U.S. News said that thousands of tanks were joining them. Now, all of that is to illustrate a history of pretty much establishment media fear-mongering over what's going on. Again, we're talking about their own soldiers in their own borders. So now, another example, in 2018, the New York Times and other media outlets were reporting of about 80,000 units on the border, and in the spring of last year, it was also reported by, again, Reuters and the New York Times, that Russia had amassed armies totaling well over 100,000 units on Ukraine's border, to them signaling that war is imminent. Now, they're reporting now that there's less than 100,000 units. Now, they don't talk about what's on the other side of the border, what's on the Ukrainian side. There's 250,000 Ukrainian units stationed on the other side of the border that are ready just in case Russia does come in to try to invade Ukraine. Now, that's also backed up by NATO weaponry, and again, NATO troops that would be more than willing to respond to any act of aggression by Russia. So, now, here's the thing. The Ukrainians, in a lot of these discussions about U.S. foreign policy, we leave out the people that are going to be the most impacted, and that's the Ukrainians themselves, right? So now, listen to what they're saying. Now, they say that the Russians, while they have always been a threat, and they've been very open about that, they also say that U.S. media, Western media, is actually overblowing the threat, and in addition, doing Putin's work for him. In fact, this is Alexei Danilov, the Chief Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. Here's what he said, quote, "We don't see any grounds for statements about a full-scale offensive on our country." Danilov also added that the tension threatens to tank their economy. And not only that, but again, the threat, which does exist and has been there for a while, for years actually, it's still not as bad as what corporate media is painting it out to be. Corporate media is pretending like this is a quick escalation and that, oh my God, they're ready to invade, even though we have seen this pattern happen for quite some time. And so now here's what he said on this to the BBC. Quote, "We emphasize this and now articulate to our partners that we cannot afford to let our economy fall. We also need help with this. After all, if people go into a state of panic, this is a very dangerous situation for the country." And again, it helps. It actually does help embolden Putin if that country is destabilized, by, again, rumors of impending invasion and war. So you create that panic, you do Putin's work for him, right? So now, again, he added that he believes the threat from Russia is no longer different than what it was in the previous year and the year before and the year before, ever since going back to 2008. So again, that's not to say that there isn't a threat, but the media has exaggerated that threat far more than what it actually is. So now, what do? Well, we escalate, we de-escalate, we de-escalate. We make sure that we don't escalate the situation by, sending more troops and sending more weapons. Now, another way that we could de-escalate the situation is, wait for it, why don't we just not ask Ukraine to join NATO? I mean, that would de-escalate the whole situation. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States wouldn't be able to help Ukraine in the case of an actual invasion if the Russians decided to do so. It just means that it would satisfy, again, that's what Putin's asking for, all right? That's what the Russians are asking for. Hey, we just don't want another NATO state on our borders. Okay. Hey, you know what? I know the whole argument of like, but you're giving in to Putin. We give him something, and you reduce the tension in the area, and you avoid a war. We get something in return. That's no war. And by the way, most importantly, the Ukrainians also don't get a war, because then they would be the most impacted, not just by conventional weapons, which would be disastrous, but also nuclear weapons, of which both the United States and Russia have gigantic arsenals of. So now, let's go back to the media angle of this, right? And so now, the tension, as I said before, is being exacerbated, escalated by pro-war pundits in major newspapers. So now, when you look at the opinion pieces, it's full of pro-war rhetoric. And you're going to be maybe amazed by this, maybe not. But overall, when they looked, when you use the search Ukraine in the fact of a global news database, the opinion pieces that you find published in the weeks between January 7th, January 28th, they found 91 articles in total, 15 in the Times, 49 in the Washington Post, and 27 in the Wall Street Journal. Okay? Overall, the tone from the three newspapers studied was very, very hawkish, with around 90% of the columns saying, get tough. In fact, here's Wesley Clark's Washington Post article. Russian President Vladimir Putin aims beyond Ukraine. Checking him right now is crucial. Well, now, how would you check him? Hopefully not with an invasion into Russia. Columnist Max Boot claimed that Putin definitely wants to resurrect the Soviet Empire. Boot's colleague at the Post, Henry Olsen, attacked Biden for not being pro-war enough. This is a guy who voted for the Iraq War, and you saw where that went, and described the president as, quote-unquote, a weakling who is unfit to lead. The Wall Street Journal attacked leftists for not wanting to go to war with Russia and China, and saying that American imperialism doesn't exist. There was also complete unanimity in presenting Russia, and not just NATO, as the sole aggressor. With 87 of the 91 articles presenting the issue as such, 4 articles did not identify anyone as the aggressor, and there was overwhelming support for sending in both huge quantities of what the Biden administration has called lethal aid. Lethal aid. Weapons. That's weapons. And also deploying American troops in the region, a move that would rapidly escalate the threat of nuclear war. As Brett Stevens wrote in the Times, the best short-term response to Putin's threats is the one the Biden administration is at last beginning to consider: the permanent deployment in large numbers of U.S. forces to frontline NATO states. From Estonia to Romania, armed shipments to Kiev, which so far are being measured in pounds, not tons, need to become a full-scale airlift, because of course that's what you need to do. You need to poke the bear further. You need to go and escalate by putting even more troops there around their country. Now, the Post went further, with one column demanding that the U.S. send around 85,000 troops to the region immediately, and a figure that they say must be matched by other NATO members. The Journal went further. Here's Walter Russell Mead, and this is what it comes down to. Military budgets, he says, will have to grow as the U.S. increases its capacity against both Russia and China. The fantasies of withdrawing from some regions to focus on others will have to be set aside. Europe, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America all require more American and allied focus and attention, even as we continue to gear up in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. will have to spend less time inspecting the moral shortcomings of potential allies and more time thinking about how it can deepen its relationships with them. Basically, what that means, this guy, Walter Russell Mead, is basically saying, let's just occupy everything. Let's just send American troops everywhere. Endless war. Yes, the defense contractors are salivating. They are drooling over this. But it gets worse. That's just mainstream media. You know what? This is on Fox News. Republican Senator Roger Wicker, here's what he said. He said that he did not want to rule out a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia. So that's what the Republicans are saying. Here you have the Democrats, a Democratic administration, and the liberal, so-called liberal press that's saying troops everywhere. Let's lethal aid, more troops, tens of thousands of American soldiers. Let's increase the defense budget by even more. It's already $768 billion a year, the more than any other country in the world. All the other modern countries in the world combined. No, we got to give more money to the military, more money to defense contractors, more weapons, more everything sent. And then Republicans, of course, because they have to be crazy and say, why don't we just nuke them? No, it's not off the table. Not off the table. No, this is insane. That's insane. No, we shouldn't do any of that. I mean, that's crazy. No, there needs to be a peaceful solution. We need to be working on peace, not any of this crap. I don't want a hot war. Now, again, the very simple thing is to say, okay, Ukraine, why don't we reconsider your membership, or just we'll postpone it. To be determined at a later date. Okay, that's all you need to do. I think that alone is worth the escalation. And that's not to say that we shouldn't defend Ukraine if the Russians decide to jump in there. Well, then that would be on the Russians for escalating the situation, which would, of course, demand a response. But for God's sakes, don't poke your way into it. Don't try to escalate the situation. Nobody wants that. Well, I mean, defense contractors do, but nobody else wants it. I don't want it. The American people don't want it. And the Ukrainian people don't want it. Let's not do that. But again, corporate media, by the way, corporate media is trying to manufacture consent for one reason. It's because they work for the defense contractors. Their military connections, they love their military connections. And those connections want to make a lot of money. And they're going to if this happens. Now, whether they fail to realize it, or maybe they do, that Russia's nuclear power and has enough missiles to destroy the entire world several times over, and we also have an even bigger complement of missiles that could destroy the world even more times than the Russians can. Well, now what's the point of that? Mutually assured destruction is not good. And I'm always going to be against that. So again, we need diplomatic solutions. Instead of the fear-mongering, I think maybe the media needs to back off a bit and actually report the facts instead of just fear-mongering on Russia. We've got to find a mutually beneficial agreement between Ukraine and the Russians that ensures both peace and security for all the parties involved.